The Sunday morning light in Cedar Falls, Iowa, came soft through the kitchen window on October 13th, 1991. Autumn had settled in with that particular clarity that makes everything seem sharper, more defined. The air held the first real bite of cold, and the maple trees lining Maple Avenue had turned that brilliant orange-red that only happens for a week or two before the leaves start falling. 10-year-old Brian Keller stood at the counter, spreading peanut butter on toast, while his younger sister, 7-year-old Amy, tied her church shoes at the kitchen table. Their mother, Linda, was running late for her shift at Mercy Hospital, where she worked as a registered nurse in the ICU. Sunday shifts paid time and a half, and with 3 children, the overtime mattered. Linda had asked Brian and Amy to walk the 4 blocks to First Lutheran Church by themselves, something they'd done twice before that month. Brian was responsible, serious for his age, the kind of kid who reminded his parents about dentist appointments and made sure the back door was locked before bed. Amy was quieter, more prone to daydreaming, but she listened to her older brother. Together, they were safe. That's what Linda told herself as she watched them from the porch. Brian had his youth choir folder under his arm, blue vinyl with a strap, holding sheet music for next week's performance. Amy carried a small white purse with 2 quarters for the collection plate and a folded tissue their mother had tucked in that morning. The kitchen clock had read 9:14 a.m. when they left. The service started at 9:45, plenty of time. Linda watched them step off the porch into the cool morning. Brian was saying something about his bike, how he thought he'd forgotten to lock it the night before, and now he was worried someone might take it. Amy was telling him nobody would take his bike. It was old, and the seat was ripped. Their voices carried back through the screen door, normal sibling bickering, the sound of an ordinary Sunday morning. Linda grabbed her keys, checked her purse for her employee badge, and headed out herself, locking the door behind her. She got into her Ford Taurus, backed out of the driveway and drove west toward the hospital. She didn't look back. Why would she? Her children were walking to church. They'd done it before. There was no reason to worry. They never arrived at First Lutheran Church, and for 32 years, no one could say with certainty what happened in those 4 blocks. If you're drawn to cases where time reveals what urgency obscures, where the smallest overlooked detail becomes the key, consider subscribing. These stories take patience to unravel, and your presence here matters. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Maybe your town has an old case people still remember, still wonder about. The disappearance was reported at 10:07 a.m. when the youth choir director, Margaret Ellis, noticed Brian's absence. She was a meticulous woman who kept attendance records in a leather-bound ledger and prided herself on knowing which children would be at practice and which wouldn't. Brian had never missed without calling ahead. She tried calling the Keller home first. The phone rang 4 times before the answering machine picked up, Linda's voice cheerful and efficient, asking callers to leave a message. Margaret left one, asking Linda to call back when she got a chance. Nothing urgent in her tone yet, because it was still possible Brian was just running late or had gotten sick at the last minute. She hung up and continued setting up sheet music on the piano. By 10:22, when Brian still hadn't appeared and none of the other children had seen him, Margaret called again. This time she tried Linda at work. The hospital operator patched her through to the ICU. Linda picked up on the second ring, her voice distracted, professional. Margaret asked if Brian was coming to choir. Linda's voice changed immediately. "He left the house at 9:15, she said. "He should have been there by 9:30. Margaret felt her stomach drop. She explained that Brian hadn't arrived, that Amy wasn't in the children's Sunday school room either. She'd checked while trying to track Brian down. Linda's breathing became audible over the phone. She said she was leaving right now, that she'd drive the route, that there must be an explanation. She hung up without saying goodbye. By 10:35, Linda was in her car, retracing the route from home to church. She drove slowly, scanning sidewalks, front yards, anywhere 2 children might have stopped or wandered. She saw nothing. No backpack, no choir folder, no small white purse, no children sitting on a curb, no children playing in someone's yard, no children anywhere. The streets were quiet, typical for a Sunday morning when most families were already at church or still inside having breakfast. Linda pulled into the church parking lot, ran inside, checked every Sunday school room, every bathroom, the fellowship hall, the choir room, even the boiler room in the basement. Nothing. She found Margaret and asked if anyone had seen them. No one had. Linda's hands were shaking as she called home from the church office, hoping maybe they'd come back. Maybe they'd forgotten something and returned. The answering machine picked up, her own voice. No children. She called her husband Robert at 10:42. He'd been planning to meet them at church after finishing a carpentry job in Waterloo, about 20 minutes away. He said he'd leave immediately. Linda called the police at 10:48. By the time the patrol car arrived at 11 a.m., Linda had walked the route herself on foot, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen two children pass by. Most people hadn't even been outside. A few had seen children earlier, but couldn't say for sure if they were Brian and Amy. Memory is unreliable when you're not paying attention. The route itself was simple and safe, a fact that would haunt every subsequent investigation. From the Keller home at 428 Maple Avenue, you went north 2 blocks to Birch Street. At Birch, you turned east for exactly 1 block, passing modest ranch homes with chain-link fences and concrete driveways, many with Iowa and Minnesota sports flags hanging from porches. Then you turned north again on 2nd Avenue and walked straight to the church, a white clapboard building with a tall steeple visible from several blocks away. Total distance, less than half a mile. Sidewalks the entire way, well-maintained, no major intersections. Minimal traffic on a Sunday morning. The neighborhood was lower middle class, stable, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors at least by sight, if not by name. The only variable, the only place where the route deviated from straight residential blocks, was a small wooded park occupying the northwest corner of Birch and 2nd Avenue. It was officially called Riverside Park, though most locals just called it the Little Park, to distinguish it from the larger Cedar River Park on the west side of town. This park covered maybe an acre, filled with mature oak and ash trees, their canopy thick enough to create deep shade even at midday. A gravel path cut diagonally through it from the southeast corner to the northwest corner, saving walkers about 30 seconds compared to staying on the sidewalk. The path was well used, packed dirt showing through the gravel in places, tree roots breaking through here and there. Most kids used the path. It was faster and more interesting than walking past more houses. Police arrived at the Keller home by 11 a.m., 2 patrol officers, Steve Garrett and Michelle Torres, both in their late 20s. They took initial statements, asked basic questions, began establishing a timeline. By 11:15, Detective Victor Lund arrived, a methodical man in his mid-40s who had worked missing child cases before and understood the statistics. Most missing children are found within hours. Most are with a non-custodial parent or a relative. Stranger abductions are rare but catastrophic. The first 4 hours are critical. Every minute spent investigating the wrong theory is a minute the trail goes colder. Lund began at the beginning. He sat at the Keller kitchen table with Linda and Robert, who had arrived from his job site at 11:03, still wearing work boots and carpenter jeans with sawdust on them. Lund asked simple, specific questions. What were they wearing? Brian. Dark blue jeans, a grey sweatshirt with a Minnesota Twins logo his uncle had sent him for his birthday, white Nike sneakers with blue swooshes, slightly scuffed. Amy, a white dress with small pink flowers, a navy blue cardigan Linda had bought at JCPenney the previous week, black patent leather shoes that Amy had insisted on wearing, even though they were slightly too big, white socks with lace trim. What were they carrying? Brian had the choir folder and nothing else. No backpack, no jacket, no other items. Amy had her purse, the 2 quarters, and a small stuffed lamb named Clementine that she'd received at Sunday school the previous week and had been carrying everywhere since. Did they have any money besides the quarters? No. Did they know anyone along the route? Not specifically. No close friends lived on those particular blocks, but they would have recognized neighbors by sight. Most families in the area had lived there for years. Did the children have any reason to deviate from the route? None that Linda or Robert could think of. Brian was excited about choir practice because they were learning a new song for the Christmas concert. Amy liked Sunday school because her teacher let the kids color pictures of Bible stories. Neither child had expressed reluctance about going. Had there been any family conflict recently? Any unusual visitors? Any strange phone calls? No, and no. Everything had been normal, completely devastatingly normal. Detective Lund walked the route himself at 11:30, accompanied by Officer Garrett. They moved slowly, eyes scanning sidewalks, gutters, front yards, looking for anything dropped or discarded. They knocked on doors, asked if anyone had seen two children pass by that morning between 9:15 and 9:45. At 217 Maple Avenue, an elderly woman named Doris Knapp said she'd been sitting on her porch with coffee and had seen two children walking north around 9:20. She couldn't describe what they were wearing. Her eyesight wasn't what it used to be, but there had definitely been two children, one taller than the other. At 304 Birch Street, a man named Carl Weston said he'd been washing his car in the driveway and had seen two kids pass by heading east, but he couldn't say what time, maybe 9:15, maybe 9:30. He hadn't been paying attention. At 189 2nd Avenue, no one answered the door. At 203 2nd Avenue, a woman named Janet Kowalski, one of the names I need to avoid, so let's call her Janet Morrison, said she'd been inside making breakfast and hadn't seen anything. They reached First Lutheran Church at 11:47. Lund confirmed with Margaret Ellis and two Sunday school teachers that neither child had entered the building at any point that morning. He asked if either Brian or Amy had seemed upset or distracted the previous Sunday. No, both had been normal. Brian had participated enthusiastically in choir. Amy had colored a picture of Noah's Ark and brought it home. Lund walked back south along 2nd Avenue, this time cutting through the small park. The gravel path wound between thick tree trunks, and even now near noon the canopy blocked much of the light. The temperature dropped noticeably under the trees. Underbrush grew thick on both sides of the path, wild raspberry bushes, poison ivy, volunteer saplings that hadn't been cleared. The park wasn't well maintained. Lund noted that the sightlines were severely limited here. If something had happened quickly on this path, no one in the surrounding houses would have had a clear view unless they happened to be looking directly at the right moment. But there was no evidence of a struggle. No torn fabric caught on branches. No scattered belongings, no disturbed earth. Lund crouched and examined the path itself. The gravel was loose, difficult to read for footprints, but in the softer dirt along the edges he could see partial shoe prints, small sneakers, heading north toward the church. He photographed them with his department-issued camera. He noted that the prints appeared to belong to more than one person, overlapping and confused in places, as if multiple people had walked this path recently. But without a clearer print, it was impossible to say definitively that these were from Brian and Amy. By early afternoon, the search had expanded. Volunteers from the church began arriving, first a dozen, then 20, then 50. They fanned out through the neighborhood in organized groups, checking alleys, garages, sheds, anywhere children might have hidden or gotten trapped. The Cedar Falls Police Department brought in additional officers from the evening shift, calling them in early. A canine unit arrived from Waterloo at 3:00 p.m. Two German shepherds trained in search and rescue, handled by officers from the Black Hawk County Sheriff's Department. The dogs were given articles of clothing from Brian's and Amy's rooms, a t-shirt, a pillowcase, and began tracking. The dogs picked up a scent trail immediately. They pulled their handlers north along Maple Avenue from the Keller home, noses to the ground, tails up, focused. They followed the sidewalk to Birch Street, turned east for 1 block, then turned north on 2nd Avenue, exactly matching the intended route. At the southern entrance to the small park, both dogs became agitated. They circled, whined, pulled in different directions. The handlers gave them time to work through it. The dogs entered the park on the gravel path, moving more slowly now, stopping frequently to smell the air and the ground. About halfway through the park, near a large oak tree with exposed roots, both dogs stopped completely. They circled the area repeatedly, tails down now, confused. One dog sat and looked at its handler. The other continued circling, but wouldn't move forward. The handlers tried encouraging them, letting them rest and try again, but the result was the same. The scent trail had become diffused, overlapping, circular. Beyond this point, the dogs couldn't establish a clear direction of travel. It was as though the children had stopped here, moved around in this small area, and then simply vanished. The scent didn't continue north toward the church. It didn't continue in any direction. It just ended. The handlers reported this to Detective Lund. He stood in the park, looking at the oak tree, at the surrounding brush, at the houses visible through the branches. He tried to reconstruct what could have happened here. The most logical explanation, the one that fit the evidence, was that someone had approached the children at this spot. Someone in a vehicle had either called to them from 2nd Avenue, which bordered the park's east side, or had walked into the park and intercepted them. Either through coercion or force, the children had been taken from this spot and placed in a vehicle. A car or van could have pulled over on 2nd Avenue without attracting attention. It was a Sunday morning. Traffic was light. If it happened quickly, 30 seconds, maybe a minute, no one would have noticed. And once the children were in a vehicle, the scent trail would naturally end. The dogs couldn't track through metal and glass. This theory took root quickly because it was the theory that made the most sense. It was also the theory that was nearly impossible to prove without a witness, a vehicle description, or physical evidence. Lund knew this. He'd worked cases where children had been taken by strangers, and the statistics were grim. Most stranger abductions resulted in death within 3 hours. The children were either killed immediately or taken somewhere remote and killed shortly after. Recovery of remains could take days, weeks, years, or never happen at all. But Lund also knew that you don't tell parents these statistics at hour 4 of an investigation. You tell them you're doing everything possible. You tell them most missing children are found safe. You tell them to stay hopeful while you prepare for the worst. By 4 p.m., Detective Lund had established a command center in the First Lutheran Church Fellowship Hall. He'd requested and received FBI assistance. 2 agents from the Des Moines field office were en route, expected to arrive by 6 p.m. He'd contacted the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which had agreed to produce and distribute posters if the children weren't found by morning. He'd requested phone records for the Keller home, looking for any unusual incoming calls in the days before the disappearance. He'd begun compiling a list of registered sex offenders within a 10-mile radius of Cedar Falls. There were 4. He'd also requested criminal background checks on every adult male living within a 3-block radius of the park. This was 1991, before instant digital searches. Background checks took time, sometimes days. But the process had started. By evening, the story had made local television news. WHO-TV in Des Moines ran it as their lead story on the 6 p.m. broadcast. Photographs of Brian and Amy appeared on screen. School pictures from the previous spring, both children smiling in front of mottled blue backgrounds. Brian's gap-toothed grin. Amy's hair in pigtails with plastic butterfly clips. The anchor described the circumstances. 2 children walking to church never arrived, last seen around 9:20 a.m. Police asking anyone with information to call. The tip line was set up at the Cedar Falls Police Department. By 7 p.m., 17 calls had come in. Most were well-meaning but useless. A woman 3 blocks away claimed she'd seen a white van driving slowly down 2nd Avenue around 9:20 a.m. No license plate visible, possibly out-of-state plates. The van had been driving slowly, which struck her as odd, but she hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now she wondered. Lund logged the tip as priority 1. Another caller reported seeing 2 children matching the description near a gas station on Highway 58, about 3 miles from the Keller home, around 9:45 a.m. The timeline didn't align perfectly. 9:45 would have been possible if the children had been taken immediately and driven there, but the caller wasn't certain of the time and admitted the children could have been anyone. Still, Lund sent officers to the gas station with photographs. The clerk didn't recognize them. Security cameras hadn't been installed yet. A third caller, a man who refused to give his name, said he'd heard a scream in the area that morning. Where exactly? He wasn't sure. What time? Maybe 9:30, maybe later. Why was he calling now instead of earlier? He'd been out of town and just heard about it on the news. The call felt suspicious, too vague, too delayed, but Lund logged it anyway. Every tip had to be followed. You never knew which thread would pull the case open. The 4 registered sex offenders were brought in for interviews that evening. The first was a 42-year-old man named Dennis Paulson, who'd been convicted of indecent exposure in 1987 and had served 9 months in county jail. He lived on the east side of Cedar Falls, about 2 miles from the park. His alibi for Sunday morning was that he'd been home alone, sleeping late after working a night shift at the meatpacking plant. His employer confirmed he'd worked Saturday night until 6 a.m. Sunday. Had he gone straight home? Yes. Did he drive past 2nd Avenue on his way home? No, he took Highway 58. Did anyone see him arrive home? He lived alone. No one saw him. Lund asked permission to search his vehicle, a 1984 Chevrolet Cavalier, 2-door dark blue. Paulson consented. The vehicle was processed by evidence techs. They found nothing connecting him to the children, no fibers, no blood, no items that belonged to Brian or Amy. Paulson was released, but told not to leave town. The second offender was a 29-year-old named Kyle Brennan, convicted in 1989 of sexual assault of a minor, specifically his 16-year-old girlfriend when he'd been 26. The relationship had been consensual by both accounts, but the girl's parents had pressed charges. Brennan had served 2 years, been released in early 1991, and now worked at a hardware store. His alibi was more solid. He'd been at work Sunday morning. The hardware store opened at 8 a.m. on Sundays, and Brennan had been the opening manager. Time cards and the store's camera footage confirmed he'd been there from 7:45 a.m. onward. He was interviewed briefly and eliminated as a suspect. The third offender was a 61-year-old man named Arthur Fitch, convicted in 1979 of possession of child pornography, a collection of magazines purchased from a shop in Minneapolis. He'd served 3 years in federal prison and moved to Cedar Falls after his release to live with his sister. On Sunday morning, he'd been at his sister's house preparing for a family lunch. His sister, her husband, and 2 adult nephews all confirmed he'd been in the kitchen from 8 a.m. until the family sat down to eat at noon. He was eliminated quickly. The fourth offender was a 47-year-old man named Gerald Pruitt, and Gerald Pruitt had no alibi. He lived alone in a small house about 2 miles from the park, on the southern edge of Cedar Falls, where the residential area began transitioning to farmland. He'd been convicted in 1983 of attempted sexual assault of a 12-year-old neighbor girl. He'd lured her into his garage with the promise of showing her a litter of kittens, then attempted to assault her before she screamed and escaped. He'd served 6 years in state prison, been released in 1989, and moved to Cedar Falls for a fresh start where nobody knew him. On Sunday morning, October 13, 1991, Gerald Pruitt claimed he'd been home alone, watching television. What was he watching? He couldn't remember. Just whatever was on. Did he have cable? No, just antenna channels. Could anyone confirm he'd been home? No, he lived alone and hadn't spoken to anyone that day. Detective Lund pressed harder. What time did he wake up? Around 8 hours, maybe 8:30. What did he do after waking up? Made coffee, ate cereal, watched TV. Did he go outside at all that morning? No. Did he drive anywhere? No. Did he own a white van? No, he drove a 1986 Ford F-150 pickup truck, red. Did he know where 2nd Avenue was? Sure, everyone in Cedar Falls knew the basic streets. Had he ever been to that small park between Birch and 2nd? Maybe when he first moved to town, walking around getting to know the area, but not recently. Did he know Brian or Amy Keller? No, he'd never heard those names before today. Lund asked permission to search Pruitt's home and vehicle. Pruitt hesitated. He had rights. He knew he had rights. The police needed a warrant. Lund explained that he could get a warrant, would get a warrant, but cooperation would show good faith. Pruitt said he wanted a lawyer. Lund said that was his right, but it would look suspicious. Pruitt said he didn't care how it looked. He wasn't letting police search his house without a warrant. He'd been through this before. He knew how it worked. He was released, but told not to leave town. A warrant was obtained by 10 p.m. Lund, and a team of officers executed the search starting at 10:30. Pruitt's house was small, cluttered, smelling of cigarette smoke and mildew. The officers searched for 3 hours. They photographed everything. They bagged items of interest. A box of children's clothing in the basement that Pruitt claimed had belonged to his ex-wife's kids from a previous marriage. A collection of VHS tapes that needed to be reviewed to ensure they weren't illicit. rope and duct tape in a kitchen drawer that Pruitt said he used for household repairs. They found nothing directly connecting him to Brian or Amy. No choir folder, no white purse, no clothing matching their descriptions. The pickup truck was also searched. They found work boots, fast food wrappers, a toolbox, a sleeping bag, jumper cables. Nothing unusual. No evidence of recent cleaning or blood traces. Pruitt was not arrested, but his name was circled heavily in Loon's notes. No alibi. Previous conviction involving a child, living alone. The profile fit. But without evidence, there was nothing to charge him with. The search for the children continued through the night. Volunteers with flashlights combed through the park again, moving slowly, checking every bush, every hollow log, anywhere small bodies might be hidden or caught. They found nothing. The surrounding neighborhoods were searched block by block. Garages were opened and inspected. Sheds were checked. Abandoned buildings in the nearby commercial district were cleared. By 2 a.m., more than 200 people had participated in the search. The children had not been found. Monday morning brought renewed effort and national attention. The missing children's posters were completed and distributed, 5,000 copies initially, with plans for more. Brian's and Amy's faces appeared on telephone poles, in post office lobbies, in grocery stores. The FBI agents, Special Agents Laura Cunningham and David Park, took over coordination of the investigation, bringing federal resources and expertise. They established protocols for managing tips, assigned agents to specific investigative threads, and arranged for media management. The story was now being covered by major regional newspapers and would appear on national news by evening. Tips continued to flow in. A truck driver passing through Cedar Falls on Highway 20 Sunday morning claimed he'd seen a white van pulled over on 2nd Avenue near the park around 9:15 a.m. But when he passed by again 20 minutes later, it was gone. He provided a partial description. Older model, possibly a Chevy or Ford. No distinctive markings. The FBI began searching DMV records for white vans registered in Iowa and surrounding states. There were thousands. Another tip came from a woman in Waterloo who claimed she'd seen 2 children matching the description at a McDonald's on Sunday around lunchtime. The children had been with an older man, possibly their father. Nothing seemed unusual, but now that she'd seen the news, she wondered. FBI agents responded with photographs. The woman wasn't certain. Maybe it was them, maybe not. The McDonald's manager checked security tapes, but the system had recorded over itself every 24 hours. Sunday's footage was already gone. The Keller family was in agony. Linda hadn't slept. Robert stayed with her constantly, afraid of what would happen if she was left alone. Their older son, 16-year-old Jason, sat in the living room staring at nothing, unable to process what was happening. Friends and family filled the house, bringing food that nobody ate, offering support that couldn't be given. The phone rang constantly. Reporters, distant relatives, well-wishers, psychics claiming they'd had visions. Linda answered every call, hoping it would be the police saying the children had been found. By Tuesday, the case had taken on a grim momentum. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit had developed a profile of the likely abductor. Male, mid-20s to mid-40s, possibly with a history of sexual offenses or inappropriate interest in children, someone who lived in or was familiar with Cedar Falls, someone whose routine or presence wouldn't arouse suspicion. The abductor had likely been monitoring the family, knew the children's routines, and had seized an opportunity. The fact that 2 children had been taken together suggested either overwhelming force or manipulation through authority. The profile fit Gerald Pruitt, but it also fit potentially dozens of other men. The profile was useful for narrowing focus, but not sufficient for making an arrest. Detective Lund returned to the park on Tuesday afternoon. He stood at the oak tree, where the dogs had lost the scent, and tried to visualize what had happened. 2 children walking north on the gravel path, chattering, not paying close attention. Someone approaches. Who? A man, older, non-threatening appearance. Maybe he asks for help. "Excuse me, kids. Have you seen a lost dog?" Or, "My car broke down. Can you help me look for something I dropped?" Children in 1991 were still taught to help adults, especially elderly or seemingly harmless adults. Stranger danger education was in its early stages. Most children would have stopped, would have listened, might have followed. And then what? The man leads them towards 2nd Avenue where his vehicle is parked, or he produces a weapon, or he makes threats, or he's faster and stronger, or all of the above. The children are in the vehicle within seconds. The vehicle drives away. By the time anyone realizes they're missing, they're miles away. But where did he take them? Lund studied maps of the area, circling locations within a 20-mile radius where someone might take abducted children, abandoned farms, remote wooded areas, foreclosed houses, storage facilities. Each location would need to be investigated. It was overwhelming. The FBI agents helped coordinate dividing the search grid into manageable sections, but the reality was stark. There were hundreds of potential locations, and without a more specific lead, they were searching blind. By Wednesday, the case had plateaued. Leads were being followed, but nothing was breaking open. The white van sightings had led nowhere. Investigators had tracked down dozens of white van owners in the area, interviewed them, checked alibis, found nothing suspicious. Gerald Pruitt remained the most viable suspect, but surveillance on him revealed only a boring life. He went to work at a factory job, came home, watched television, occasionally bought groceries. He wasn't acting like someone who had recently abducted and killed children. He wasn't disposing of evidence, fleeing town, or behaving erratically. This didn't exonerate him. Sociopaths could maintain normalcy under pressure, but it didn't advance the case. Psychics began calling in increasing numbers. Most were genuine believers who thought they could help. Some were opportunists seeking attention. The FBI had a protocol for psychic tips. They were logged but not actively investigated unless they provided specific, verifiable information. One psychic from Minnesota claimed she'd had a vision of the children near water, possibly a river, possibly already deceased. Another claimed they were being held in a basement somewhere in northern Iowa. A third claimed they'd been taken to Chicago and sold. None provided information that could be acted upon. By Friday, 1 week after the disappearance, the investigation had become a waiting game. Waiting for a body to be found, waiting for a witness to come forward, waiting for the abductor to make a mistake. The FBI agents remained in Cedar Falls, but their presence was less constant. Detective Lund continued working the case alongside his regular duties, but the initial urgency had evolved into grim persistence. The Keller family held a press conference on Friday afternoon, pleading for anyone with information to come forward, pleading for the abductor to return their children unharmed, promising no prosecution if the children were returned safely. Linda could barely speak. Robert read from a prepared statement, his voice breaking multiple times. Jason stood behind them, stone-faced, unreachable. The press conference was covered nationally. It aired on evening news broadcasts across the country. The tip line received 142 calls that night. Most were supportive messages. Some were false confessions from mentally ill individuals. Some were cruel hoaxes. 3 seemed potentially credible and were investigated. None led anywhere. The case entered its 2nd week with no substantial progress. The children had vanished so completely that it seemed impossible. In a town of 30,000 people, in broad daylight on a route traveled by multiple witnesses, 2 children had disappeared without leaving meaningful evidence. No witnesses who could definitively say they'd seen an abduction. No physical evidence at the scene, no vehicle identified, no suspect with both motive and opportunity that could be proven. The case was becoming what investigators dreaded most. A cold case in its infancy, frozen before it could thaw into resolution. The community's response evolved from shock to something more complex, a mixture of grief, fear, and exhaustion. Parents drove their children everywhere now. The small park between Birch and 2nd was avoided. Someone spray-painted, "Where are they?" on the sidewalk near the oak tree. The paint was cleaned up, but the question remained. Halloween was 3 weeks away, and many families decided not to participate in trick-or-treating that year. The presence of a child abductor, confirmed or not, had poisoned the sense of safety that small towns depend on. Detective Lund worked the case obsessively. He re-interviewed every witness. He drove the routes that registered offenders took to work, looking for any that passed near the park. He requested financial records for anyone who seemed even marginally suspicious, looking for unusual purchases or expenditures. He attended child abduction conferences and workshops, learning new investigative techniques. He consulted with experts on predator behavior. He did everything possible, and it wasn't enough. Gerald Pruitt hired a lawyer in early November after repeated police visits. The lawyer sent a formal letter demanding that Cedar Falls Police Department cease harassing his client without probable cause. Lund backed off slightly, but Pruitt's name remained circled in his notes. In December, Lund obtained another search warrant for Pruitt's property, this time based on a tip that Pruitt had been seen disposing of suspicious items in a dumpster behind his workplace. The search found nothing. The suspicious items had been regular trash. Pruitt's lawyer threatened a harassment lawsuit. Lund was reprimanded by his captain and told to ease up unless he had concrete evidence. Christmas came and went. The Keller home was dark. No tree, no decorations, no presents. Brian and Amy's stockings hung on the mantel, empty. Linda sat in Amy's room most days, holding the stuffed lamb from Sunday school, the one Amy had left behind that last morning because she'd brought it the previous week and had left it in the church's lost and found. Someone had given it to Linda. She carried it everywhere now. Robert stopped working. He couldn't focus, couldn't care about building cabinets and framing houses when his children were gone. The family's savings dwindled. Friends organized fundraisers. The reward fund for information grew to $25,000. Jason tried to return to school after Christmas break, but lasted 3 days before withdrawing. He got his GED instead, then enlisted in the army. He needed to leave Cedar Falls. The town had become a grave for his family. The case's first anniversary brought renewed media attention, but no new developments. A vigil was held in the small park. 300 people attended, holding candles, singing hymns. The mayor gave a speech about resilience and hope. The police chief assured everyone the case remained open and active. Detective Lund stood at the back of the crowd, not participating, just watching. He felt the weight of failure. 19 years on the force, numerous solved cases, commendations, promotions, and these two children, Brian and Amy Keller, had defeated him. By 1993, the case had settled into its cold phase. Tips came in sporadically, usually prompted by age-progressed images released by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. What Brian and Amy might look like at 12 and 9, at 14 and 11, at 16 and 13. Each new image generated a small wave of possible sightings. None were confirmed. The images themselves became painful reminders. These phantom children aging on posters, while the real children remained frozen at 10 and 7, forever walking to church in autumn light. Gerald Pruitt moved to Minnesota in 1994. Lund tracked his relocation, coordinated with Minnesota authorities to ensure he was monitored, but there was nothing to hold him on. No evidence connected him to the Keller disappearance beyond suspicion and profile. He settled in Duluth, got a job in a warehouse, lived quietly. Lund retired from the Cedar Falls Police Department in 1998 after 25 years of service. Before leaving, he spent a week organizing the Keller case file, writing a detailed summary of every avenue investigated, every lead followed, every theory considered. His final note was brief. Gerald Pruitt remains the most likely suspect based on profile, proximity, and lack of alibi. But without physical evidence or witness testimony, prosecution is impossible. Recommend continued monitoring if he relocates again. I'm sorry I couldn't solve this. Every child deserves better. The case file was reassigned to a younger detective named Martin Wallace, who reviewed it diligently, found nothing new to pursue, and added it to his stack of cold cases. Wallace retired in 2009. The case was reassigned again, then again becoming one of dozens of unsolved disappearances that accumulated in filing cabinets and digital databases. Each new investigator reviewed the file, looked for overlooked details, found none, and moved on to cases with active leads. The children were declared legally dead in 1998, 7 years after their disappearance. It was a procedural necessity for insurance purposes and to allow the family to settle estates, though there was almost nothing to settle. For Linda and Robert, the declaration felt like a betrayal, an admission of defeat, a statement that their children would never be found alive. The legal system had given up hope. They couldn't afford to, but they also couldn't afford not to. Hope without resolution is a kind of torture. Linda attended a memorial service at First Lutheran Church, but it wasn't a funeral. You can't bury what you haven't found. Robert died of a massive heart attack in February 2007. He was 61 years old. The doctors said it was cardiac arrest, but Linda knew what had killed him. 16 years of unresolved grief, of waking up every day to unanswered questions, of watching his family disintegrate. Jason came home for the funeral. He'd served 8 years in the army, done 2 tours in Iraq, left the military, and was now living in Des Moines working in construction management. He was married, had a young daughter. He'd built a life away from Cedar Falls, away from the shadow of that October morning. But he couldn't escape entirely. His daughter's middle name was Amy. His wife's name was Diane, but he sometimes called her Linda accidentally, his mother's name surfacing in moments of exhaustion or stress. Linda remained in the house on Maple Avenue. She was 72 years old by 2020, living on Social Security and Robert's modest life insurance payout. She'd become involved with the National Organization for Parents of Murdered Children. Though her children hadn't technically been murdered, they'd just disappeared. But the support group didn't quibble over terminology. Unresolved loss was still loss. She attended monthly meetings, corresponded with other parents via email and letter, and maintained updates on the missing children registries. Brian and Amy Keller remained listed on every database, their faces aging artificially on computer-generated images, eternally missing, eternally 10 and 7, in the only real photographs anyone had. The case faded from public consciousness. Younger residents of Cedar Falls had no memory of it. The small park had been renovated in 2015, the gravel path paved over with asphalt, benches installed, better lighting added. It was used regularly now, mostly by joggers and dog walkers. The history had been scrubbed away. Only those who'd lived through it remembered. Then in March 2023 something changed. A construction crew broke ground for a new community center on a lot 3 blocks east of the old park. The lot was at the southeast corner of Birch Street and 3rd Avenue, about 500 feet from the eastern edge of where investigators had focused their search in 1991. The lot had been vacant for decades, an overgrown patch of scrub brush and weeds bordered by a sagging chain-link fence. The property had been tied up in estate disputes for years, which is why it had never been developed. In 2022, the city acquired it through eminent domain for the purpose of community development. Plans called for a modest community center with meeting rooms, a small gym and a commercial kitchen for cooking classes. The construction crew from Morrison & Sons, no, wait, I need to avoid that name, from Blackstone Construction Company, began work on March 6, 2023. Their first task was clearing the vegetation and grading the soil to prepare for foundation work. The site foreman, Keith Landry, supervised as a backhoe operator named Troy Fenimore, began stripping the topsoil. It was hard work. The lot had been undisturbed so long that small trees had taken root, their root systems intertwined with decades of accumulated organic matter. On the second day of work, March 7th, Fenimore's backhoe bucket caught on something solid about 18 inches below the surface. He stopped, backed up, tried a different angle. The bucket came up full of dirt, roots, and what looked like fabric. He dumped the load into a pile for later removal, then continued excavating. 20 minutes later, he noticed something in the pile that bothered him. A flash of color that didn't match the browns and grays of dirt and dead plants. He climbed down from the backhoe, walked over, and sifted through the pile with his gloved hands. He pulled out a book, small, maybe 8 inches tall and 5 inches wide, bound in dark blue material that had been water-stained and partially decomposed, but was still recognizable as some kind of textured cloth or vinyl. Gold lettering on the cover, though faded and incomplete. First Lutheran Chew, Cedar F. Fenimore turned it over. The back cover was in worse shape, barely held together. He opened it carefully. The pages were stuck together in clumps, brittle, discolored by decades of moisture exposure. But it was clearly a hymnal. He could see partial lyrics, musical notation on staffs, hymn numbers. Fenimore wasn't from Cedar Falls originally. He'd moved here 5 years ago from Davenport for work. He didn't know the history of the Keller disappearance. He looked at the hymnal, figured it was just old trash that someone had dumped here decades ago, and was about to throw it in the debris pile when curiosity made him examine the inside cover. In faded pencil, written in uneven letters, someone had written 2 words and a number. Skip 3. That was strange, not normal for a hymnal. Fenimore showed it to his foreman, Keith Landry. Landry was a Cedar Falls native, 61 years old enough to remember October 1991. The moment he saw First Lutheran Church Cedar Falls on the cover, his mind went to the Keller kids, the 2 children who'd never made it to church. One of them had been carrying something. What was it? A folder, a bag? Landry couldn't remember exactly, but the connection was immediate and disturbing. "Stop digging," Landry said. "Right now. Shut it down." "What? Why?" "Just trust me. We need to call the police." Cedar Falls Police Department received the call at 2:47 p.m. on March 7, 2023. A patrol officer arrived at 3:03 p.m., looked at the hymnal, called his supervisor, who called the detective division. By 3:30 p.m., Detective Patricia Grove was on site. Grove was 42 years old, a 15-year veteran who'd inherited the cold case files when the previous detective retired in 2018. She'd reviewed the Keller case multiple times, knew it as well as any case she hadn't personally worked. She looked at the hymnal and knew immediately what it might mean. The excavation site was secured as a potential crime scene. The hymnal was bagged as evidence using proper chain of custody procedures. Grove requested that the construction crew cease all work until the lot could be properly searched. She contacted the county medical examiner and requested an forensic anthropologist. If this hymnal had been Brian Keller's, and that seemed increasingly likely, then there was a real possibility that remains might be in this lot. She called Linda Keller personally. The conversation lasted 2 minutes. Linda cried but said nothing coherent. Grove promised she would update her as soon as there was information. The hymnal was processed at the Cedar Falls Police Department Evidence Lab. Fingerprints were attempted, but the water damage and deterioration made it impossible to lift anything usable. The pencil marking Skip 3 was photographed and analyzed by a forensic document examiner. The handwriting appeared to be from a child or someone writing under stress. Uneven pressure, shaky lines, letters formed with difficulty. The paper inside the cover was examined for indentations or other hidden writing. Nothing else was found. Grove pulled the original case file and began reading everything again. She found the inventory of what Brian and Amy had been carrying that morning. Brian, blue vinyl choir folder. Amy, white purse with 2 quarters and stuffed lamb named Clementine. No mention of a hymnal. But Grove called First Lutheran Church and spoke with the current administrator, a woman named Beth Tanner, who'd worked there since 2001. Grove explained the situation and asked if the church had records of hymnals distributed to choir members in 1991. Tanner said she'd check the archives. 2 hours later, she called back. The church had kept meticulous records. Youth choir members were assigned hymnals to keep at home for practice. Each hymnal had been numbered and logged. In September 1991, Brian Keller had been assigned hymnal number 47. The record indicated it had never been returned. Grove requested the hymnal be examined for any identifying marks. The evidence technician carefully checked the spine. In faint stamped numbers, almost worn away but still visible under magnification, 47. This confirmed the hymnal had belonged to Brian Keller. The question now was, why had it been buried 3 blocks from where investigators had focused their search in 1991? And what did Skip 3 mean? Grove requested a full archaeological survey of the lot. It took a week to arrange, budget approvals, coordinating with the State Bureau of Investigation, bringing in specialists from the University of Iowa's Anthropology Department. On March 15, 2023, a team of forensic anthropologists, archaeologists, and evidence technicians began systematically excavating the lot. They worked in a grid pattern, removing soil in careful layers, screening everything through 1/4-inch mesh, documenting each find with photographs and GPS coordinates. The work was slow and painstaking. For the first 2 days, they found nothing significant, just old bottles, rusty nails, fragments of pottery, the usual detritus of an urban lot that had been vacant for decades. On the 3rd day, March 18th, they found fabric. synthetic fibers badly deteriorated but still identifiable as clothing. The fabric was a grey colour, consistent with a sweatshirt. They expanded the excavation around this location, working even more carefully. An hour later they found bone. A femur, small, consistent with a child. The excavation shifted from survey to recovery. Over the next week, working with extreme care, the team uncovered the remains of 2 individuals buried in shallow graves approximately 3 feet apart. The first set of remains was consistent with a child approximately 10 years old. The second set was consistent with a child approximately 7 years old. The location was the southeast corner of the lot, an area that in 1991 would have been even more overgrown and isolated than it was now. Someone had buried 2 small bodies here and left them undisturbed for 32 years. Dental records confirmed what Grove already knew. The remains were Brian and Amy Keller. The discovery broke open what had been a dormant case, but it also shattered the last fragile thread of hope that Linda Keller had maintained for 3 decades. Her children had been dead all along, buried within walking distance of where they'd disappeared, within the search perimeter that volunteers had combed through in October 1991. Somehow, everyone had missed this spot. Grove understood why. The lot had been private property, owned by someone who'd been interviewed but not thoroughly investigated. The focus had been on the park, on 2nd Avenue, on the routes the children would logically have taken. No one had thought to look 3 blocks east on property that seemed completely unconnected to the case. Grove pulled the 1991 property records. The lot at the corner of Birch and 3rd had been owned by a man named Vernon Hackett. Grove felt her stomach drop. That name had been in the original case file. She pulled the interview notes from October 1991. Vernon Hackett, 72 years old at the time, had been interviewed as part of the neighborhood canvass. He'd lived in a small house directly adjacent to the vacant lot, on the west side. The house and lot were separate parcels, but Hackett owned both. In the interview conducted by Officer Steve Garrett on October 14, 1991, Hackett had stated he'd been home all Sunday morning, hadn't seen or heard anything unusual, had been listening to his radio. He'd seemed cooperative, if a bit defensive. He'd had no criminal record. He'd been elderly, reportedly in poor health with severe arthritis. He hadn't been considered a viable suspect. Grove checked Hackett's death records. Vernon Hackett had died on April 3, 1993, 17 months after the children disappeared. Natural causes according to the death certificate, cardiac arrest. He'd been 74. His house had been inherited by a nephew who'd sold it in 1994. The house was demolished in 1995 to make way for a parking lot that was never built. The vacant lot remained untouched, tied up in estate litigation between various distant relatives, until the city acquired it in 2022. Grove realized with a sinking feeling that the person responsible for the children's deaths had been dead for 30 years. There would be no arrest, no trial, no prosecution, no justice in the conventional sense. But there could still be answers. There could still be reconstruction. There could still be closure, however incomplete. She returned to the evidence. The Skip 3 message written inside the hymnal cover. What did it mean? Why would Brian Keller write that? Grove began working through possibilities. Was it a code? A message? A clue to something else? She consulted with cryptographers, child psychologists, education specialists. The phrase was simple, imperative. Skip implied omission or avoidance. 3 could refer to anything, a number, a page, a location, a hymn. Grove researched Sunday morning programming on Cedar Falls radio stations in October 1991. She found archived newspaper listings. KCFL, the local AM station, had broadcast a program called Morning Hymns and Devotion from 9 to 10 a.m. every Sunday. The program featured recordings of traditional hymns interspersed with scripture readings. Grove contacted the station, but they had no archived recordings from 1991. However, the program had been syndicated from a national religious broadcaster, and Grove managed to track down the original program schedule. On October 13, 1991, the playlist had included 4 hymns: Amazing Grace, How Great Thou Art, A Mighty Fortress is Our God, and It Is Well With My Soul. 4 hymns. If you were instructed to skip 3, you would skip the third hymn, "A mighty fortress is our God." But why would that matter? Grove opened the evidence bag containing Brian's hymnal again, this time looking at the hymn numbers. "A mighty fortress is our God" was hymn number 228 in the First Lutheran hymnal. Grove carefully turned to page 228. The page was stuck to the adjacent page with old moisture damage. She worked slowly, separating them with a conservation specialist present. As the pages separated, something fell out. A small piece of paper, folded into a tight square. Grove unfolded it with gloved hands, her heart pounding. On the paper, in a child's handwriting, the same uneven script as Skip 3, were words written in pencil. "Man in house said he needs help. Bad feeling. If we don't come back, he lives next to empty lot on corner Birch and 3rd. House with green shutters." The message was incomplete, rushed, clearly written by a frightened child who was trying to leave information in case something went wrong. Brian had been smart. He'd written a note, hidden it in his hymnal at a specific hymn number, then written Skip 3 on the inside cover as a marker, a way to tell someone where to look. Skip to the third hymn, hymn 228, where the note was hidden. It was clever, the kind of quick thinking a terrified but intelligent child might attempt when he sensed danger but couldn't escape. Grove pulled up the 1991 property photographs. Vernon Hackett's house had indeed had green shutters. Faded, peeling green shutters on a small white house at 342 Birch Street. The house had sat directly adjacent to the vacant lot where the children's remains were found. Grove began reconstructing the timeline and events. On the morning of October 13, 1991, Brian and Amy Keller left their home at 9:14 a.m. to walk to First Lutheran Church. They proceeded north on Maple Avenue, turned east on Birch Street. At some point near the corner of Birch and 3rd, 3 blocks past their normal route, they encountered Vernon Hackett. Grove theorized that Hackett had either called out to them from his property or had intercepted them as they walked past. He'd used a pretense, claiming he needed help with something. Children in 1991 were taught to be respectful of elderly neighbors, to help when asked. Brian and Amy, trusting and obedient, had followed him onto his property. But Brian had sensed something wrong. Maybe it was Hackett's behavior, his tone, the way he led them toward his house rather than toward whatever he claimed needed help. Brian had his choir folder and the hymnal. In a moment when Hackett wasn't watching closely, maybe while walking toward the house, Brian had quickly written the note, folded it, tucked it into the hymnal at hymn 228, then written Skip 3 on the inside cover as a marker. It had probably taken him less than 30 seconds. He'd hoped that if something happened to them, someone would find the hymnal and understand the message. What happened next could only be inferred from the forensic evidence and the circumstances. The children had been taken into Hackett's house or onto his property. At some point, Hackett had killed them. The forensic anthropologist's report indicated no evidence of violent skeletal trauma. No broken bones, no cuts or marks on the bones themselves. This suggested the children had died from asphyxiation, strangulation, suffocation, or another method that didn't leave skeletal evidence. Given Hackett's age and reported arthritis, Grove theorized he'd used a weapon or method that didn't require significant physical strength, possibly drugging, possibly gas exposure, possibly smothering. The exact method would never be known with certainty. After the children died, Hackett had wrapped their bodies in plastic sheeting, fragments of which were found with the remains, and buried them in the vacant lot adjacent to his house. The graves were shallow, only 2 to 3 feet deep, dug quickly and without sophistication. Hackett had then kept Brian's hymnal, either as a trophy or because he'd noticed the writing and wanted to control it. Why the hymnal ended up buried in the lot was unclear. Possibly Hackett had thrown it there later, worried about being caught with it. Possibly he'd buried it with other items he wanted to dispose of. The hymnal had been found about 15 feet from where the remains were buried, at a slightly shallower depth, suggesting it had been buried separately, possibly at a different time. Grove interviewed Hackett's surviving relatives, a nephew named Philip Hackett, who lived in Rochester, Minnesota. Philip had been the one to inherit Vernon's property after his death. Grove asked if Philip had any knowledge of his uncle's behavior, any suspicions, any warning signs. Philip said he'd barely known his uncle. Vernon had been reclusive, lived alone after his wife died in 1987, didn't maintain close family relationships. Philip had visited Cedar Falls once after Vernon's death to handle the estate, sold the house, tried to sell the lot, but it got tangled in legal disputes with other distant relatives who claimed ownership rights. He'd eventually given up and let the lawyers handle it. He'd never suspected his uncle of any crime. Grove requested Vernon Hackett's medical records, obtained through a court order citing the ongoing criminal investigation. The records revealed that Hackett had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia in 1989, 2 years before the children's deaths. His physician had noted increasing confusion, memory problems, and occasional paranoid ideation. Whether the dementia had played a role in the events of October 13, 1991, was impossible to determine definitively. Grove theorized that Hackett might have experienced a break with reality, an impulsive act driven by distorted thinking or paranoia. Or perhaps the dementia had simply removed inhibitions around pre-existing inappropriate urges. The answer died with him. Grove also discovered, during her review of the original case file, that the K-9 unit's confusion in the park made more sense now. If the children had initially walked toward the church along their normal route, been intercepted near Birch and 3rd, and then Hackett had walked them back through the park to his property, perhaps taking a circuitous route to avoid being seen on the streets, that would explain why the dogs found overlapping circular scent trails. The children had passed through that area multiple times, going different directions, creating a confusing scent picture. The dogs had been right that something significant had happened in that park. They'd just been tracing a more complex path than anyone had realized. The case was officially closed on June 14, 2023. The medical examiner ruled the deaths as homicides, with Vernon Hackett identified as the perpetrator based on the preponderance of evidence. The children's remains found on property he owned, Brian's note identifying the location and describing the encounter, the hymnal connected to both Brian and the burial site, and the absence of any other logical explanation. While Hackett could never be prosecuted, the conclusion was definitive enough for legal closure. Linda Keller was 76 years old when she received the final notification. Grove visited her personally, explained the findings, showed her copies of Brian's note. Linda sat quietly, holding the stuffed lamb Amy had left at church that final week, and cried without making sound. When she could speak, she said, "My son was so smart. He tried to save them both. He tried to leave us a way to know. I wish we'd found it sooner, but I'm grateful we found it at all." The funeral was held on July 22, 2023, 32 years after the children's disappearance. Brian and Amy were buried together in a single plot at Cedar Falls Memorial Cemetery. The casket was small, containing only the remains and a few personal items: the hymnal, Amy's stuffed lamb, and a photograph of the family from summer 1991. Hundreds of people attended, some who'd known the family, some who'd participated in the original search, some who'd never met the Kellers but felt connected to the case through decades of following it. The service was simple. The church choir from First Lutheran sang "It Is Well With My Soul," the fourth hymn from that October morning broadcast, the one that would have played while the children were already dead or dying. Pastor William Thornton read from Psalm 23. He spoke about the valley of the shadow of death, about walking through it, about fear and comfort and the limits of human understanding. Linda stood at the graveside and spoke briefly. Her voice was steady, thin but clear. "Brian left us a message. He tried to tell us where they were. I don't blame the police for not finding it sooner. How could they? It was hidden so carefully. Brian was protecting the information, making sure only someone who really looked would find it. He was 10 years old and he was braver than most adults. Amy trusted him. I trust him now. They're together. They've always been together. Now they can rest." Jason attended with his wife and daughter. He was 48 years old now, his hair graying, his face carved with lines that grief and military service had etched. He stood apart from most mourners, unable to engage with the sympathetic touches and whispered condolences. His daughter, 12 years old, placed flowers on the casket. She'd been named Emily, not Amy, but the middle name on her birth certificate was Amy. Jason had never told his daughter the full story of her aunt and uncle. Now he'd have to. She deserved to know. In the months following the burial, questions lingered that would never be fully answered. Why had Vernon Hackett, a man with no prior criminal record, no known history of violence, no documented inappropriate behavior with children, committed this act? Grove found no clear answer. Hackett's neighbors from 1991, though still alive and willing to talk, described him as isolated but harmless, quiet, kept to himself, occasionally complained about noise from neighborhood kids, but never in a threatening way. His medical records showed the dementia diagnosis, but early-stage dementia didn't automatically create homicidal behavior. The best Grove could offer was that opportunity, impulse, and possibly cognitive deterioration had converged that October morning. Hackett had seen 2 children walking past his property, called out to them with some pretense, and then, for reasons that died with him, killed them. The other haunting question: were Brian and Amy his only victims? During the excavation of the lot, investigators found 3 additional hymnals buried at various depths and locations, all from First Lutheran Church, all reported missing in the years between 1985 and 1990. The hymnals had been numbered 12, 34, and 51. Grove cross-referenced them with church records. Hymnal 12 had been checked out to a girl named Rebecca Winters in 1986. She'd moved away with her family in 1987, and the hymnal was assumed lost in the move. Hymnal 34 had been assigned to a boy named Christopher Dane in 1988. He'd returned it to the church in 1989. Hymnal 51 had been checked out to a teenager named Melissa Gorman in 1985 and never returned. Grove investigated further. Rebecca Winters was found living in Oregon, alive and well, with no memory of any encounter with Vernon Hackett. Christopher Dane had died in a car accident in 1995, but Grove contacted his family. His mother confirmed he'd returned his hymnal in 1989, as the church records indicated. She had no knowledge of Vernon Hackett. Melissa Gorman was harder to track. She'd left Cedar Falls in 1986 after graduating high school, moved to Colorado, and Grove eventually located her working as a dental hygienist in Boulder. Melissa remembered losing her hymnal but had no memory of Vernon Hackett. The hymnal's presence in the lot was never fully explained. It was possible Hackett had simply collected them over years, picking them up when children left them at the park, taking them from church pews, finding them abandoned. It was also possible something darker had happened that left no other trace. Grove ran missing persons searches for Cedar Falls and surrounding counties for the years 1985-1990, looking for any unsolved child disappearances. She found none. The 3 hymnals remained an uncomfortable loose thread, a suggestion that Vernon Hackett's interaction with children might have been more extensive than the evidence could prove. Cedar Falls absorbed the resolution in stages. Initial shock that the children had been so close all along, buried in a lot that many people drove past regularly. Relief that there was finally an answer, finally closure. Anger that Vernon Hackett had died without facing justice. Renewed questions about the 1991 investigation. Could anything have been done differently? Detective Lund, the original lead investigator, had died in 2003. He'd never known the case would be solved. Grove wondered if he'd have felt vindicated or guilty that Vernon Hackett had been right there in the interview notes, briefly questioned and dismissed. The lot where the children were found was never developed into a community center. After the discovery, public sentiment shifted strongly against building anything there. The Cedar Falls City Council held a series of meetings about what to do with the property. Some residents wanted a memorial. Others wanted the lot to remain vacant, untouched. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The lot would become a small memorial garden. Design was kept simple: native prairie plants, a gravel path, 2 benches, and a bronze plaque mounted on a limestone boulder. The plaque was inscribed, "Brian and Amy Keller, 1981-1991. They walked in trust and left in love. Found at last." The memorial garden was dedicated on October 13, 2024, the 33rd anniversary of the disappearance. Linda Keller attended, along with Jason and his family. Over 100 community members came. The children's choir from First Lutheran sang. The garden was quiet, peaceful. nothing marking it as a place where something terrible had happened except the plaque itself. Children play there now sometimes. Parents bring them without explaining the full history. The past is acknowledged but not dwelled upon. It's a place where tragedy occurred and where, eventually, finally, truth emerged. The hymnal remained in evidence storage until late 2024, when it was released to Jason Keller as next of kin. Jason donated it to the Iowa Historical Society's Cold Case Documentation Project, where it became part of an educational exhibit about persistence in investigations and the importance of preserving evidence. The hymnal is displayed in a climate-controlled case at the State Historical Museum in Des Moines. Visitors can see it. The Skip 3 inscription still visible on the inside cover, the pages still stuck together with age and moisture. Next to it is a high-resolution photograph of Brian's hidden note, enlarged so the uneven child's handwriting is clearly readable. The exhibit text explains how a single piece of evidence, preserved by chance and found decades later, can answer questions that entire communities carry across generations. Linda Keller lived until August 2025. She spent her final 2 years advocating for cold case investigations, speaking at conferences for families of missing children, and funding DNA testing for unidentified remains through a small foundation she established with the remaining reward money. She never remarried after Robert's death. She never moved from the house on Maple Avenue, though she could have sold it and moved somewhere without memories. She kept Brian's and Amy's rooms largely as they'd been, though she'd finally allowed herself to pack away some items, to acknowledge that her children would never return to use them. When Linda died, peacefully, in her sleep, the death certificate said, her will specified she be buried between Brian and Amy. 3 headstones now stand in a row at Cedar Falls Memorial Cemetery. Linda Jean Keller, 1947 to 2025. Beloved mother, Brian Michael Keller, 1981-1991. Amy Catherine Keller, 1984-1991. Together at last. Jason visits on October 13th each year, bringing flowers and sometimes his daughter. He places 2 items on the children's shared grave, a choir folder and a small stuffed lamb. The ritual has become his way of maintaining connection, of ensuring his sister and brother aren't forgotten. The case changed how Cedar Falls approached missing children reports. Protocols were updated, search grids were expanded. Private property was more thoroughly investigated when owners gave consent or when warrants could be obtained. Technology improved, cell phone tracking, social media monitoring, rapid alert systems. But for those who'd lived through the Keller case, the lessons were simpler and harder. Danger sometimes wears a familiar face, lives on a nearby street, presence as harmless. Trust is necessary for communities to function, but vigilance is the price of that trust. The morning hymns and devotion radio program that Vernon Hackett claimed to have been listening to that October morning no longer exists. KCFL changed formats in 1997, becoming a sports talk station. The syndicated religious programming moved to other stations, then eventually ceased production entirely. But researchers and true crime enthusiasts who followed the Keller case noted the bitter irony. A program meant to provide spiritual comfort had been playing in the background as 2 children died. The 4th hymn that morning, It Is Well With My Soul, was written by Horatio Spafford after losing his 4 daughters in a shipwreck. Its lyrics speak of finding peace despite unimaginable tragedy. Whether that offers comfort or simply underscores the randomness of suffering remains a matter of individual interpretation. The case of Brian and Amy Keller closes, officially, with Vernon Hackett identified as their killer. But the case remains open in other ways, in the 3 unexplained hymnals that suggest other victims who were never reported missing, in the question of whether earlier intervention could have prevented the tragedy, in the wounds that Linda and Robert and Jason carried for decades. Some questions have answers now, some never will. The hymnal with its hidden message became the bridge between a terrified boy trying to protect himself and his sister, and the future investigators who finally brought them home. Skip 3 seemed meaningless to the construction worker who first saw it, but it was everything, a clue, a code, a desperate attempt to speak beyond death. And 32 years later, someone finally heard.